In May 1942 at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a quiet test range became the stage for a major shift in infantry warfare. Early sunlight stretched across the field as Lieutenant Edward Ewell lifted a roughly 5-foot steel tube to his shoulder. What he held would later be recognized as one of World War II's most influential battlefield tools. At that moment, however, it was an improvised device assembled from salvaged metal, a repurposed wooden stock, and a great deal of uncertainty about whether it would function safely. Ewell, only 24 years old and recently graduated from Lehigh University with top academic honors in engineering, had spent weeks confronting a stubborn technical challenge. The shaped charge grenade available to him could burn through 4 inches of hardened armor, enough to defeat any German tank then in service. Yet it weighed over 3 pounds, far too heavy to be thrown to a safe distance. Soldiers needed a reliable way to deliver that explosive force without exposing themselves to lethal danger. Army leadership demanded a solution that could be used by ordinary infantry without specialized training and produced quickly. Nearby, Captain Leslie Skinner observed through field glasses, a clipboard in hand. During the project, he would be promoted to major in recognition of his work. Skinner, 42, had been experimenting with rockets since his youth, long before the Army showed serious interest. As a teenager at Fort Strong in Massachusetts, one of his early experiments had accidentally ignited part of a hospital roof, much to the dismay of his father, an Army surgeon. Despite that incident, his fascination with rocketry persisted and eventually brought him to this test, where he and O hoped to demonstrate a new anti-tank weapon. Behind them stood several senior officers, including Brigadier General Gladion Marcus Barnes, head of research and development for Army Ordnance. Barnes had agreed without much enthusiasm to observe what headquarters had dismissed as a novelty, Skinner's shoulder-fired rocket launcher. The Army faced urgent problems. German armored units had demonstrated the effectiveness of mechanized warfare across Europe and North Africa, while American infantry lacked dependable weapons for stopping tanks. Some troops were being taught to attach magnetic mines directly onto enemy armor, a tactic with predictably severe casualties. The device Ewell carried appeared crude. It was a simple open-ended tube fitted with improvised sights made that very morning from bent wire. Inside sat a rocket equipped with a shaped charge warhead. The firing system relied on a basic battery and a trigger assembled from available parts. Nothing about the launcher suggested precision manufacturing. It looked like a hurried improvisation born of necessity. Even so, the prototype represented months of trial and error. The origins of this weapon, later called the bazooka, reached back well before 1942. During World War I, American pioneer Robert Goddard had explored rocket-propelled weapons that might give infantry portable firepower against fortified positions. When the war ended in 1918, enthusiasm for such experimental systems faded, and his research was largely shelved for 2 decades. By 1940, however, the rapid advance of German armored forces made those earlier ideas relevant again. Stationed at the Indian Head Rocket Laboratory in Maryland, Skinner revisited Goddard's studies. The concept of solid-fuel rockets delivering explosive payloads with minimal recoil was technically sound. The remaining challenges involved developing a sufficiently powerful warhead and a launcher simple enough for widespread use. The shaped charge effect, known since the late 19th century, when Charles Monroe discovered that hollowed explosives could focus their energy into a concentrated jet, offered a solution. By 1941, American ordnance engineers had produced the Machine-shaped charge grenade, capable of penetrating armor effectively. However, it was too heavy to throw and unsafe to fire from a standard rifle due to the blast. In late 1940, Skinner outlined the idea of launching such a warhead from a tube using rocket propulsion. At first, he was told no suitable warhead existed. When the man became available in 1942, the proposal suddenly appeared feasible. Skinner assigned Ewell to develop the launcher after the young engineer joined his Special Projects Unit in mid-1941. Ewell experimented with numerous designs. He needed to protect the operator from exhaust, stabilize the projectile in flight, and provide aiming sights accurate enough for combat distances. Progress was slow until an unexpected discovery changed the direction of the project. Passing a scrap pile at the laboratory, Ewell noticed a steel tube roughly 5 feet long and about 60 millimeters wide, almost the exact diameter of the M10 grenade. Holding it to his shoulder, he realized a rocket could be housed inside. The open rear would allow exhaust gases to vent safely away from the user. The concept was straightforward: place a rocket in a tube, aim and fire. He quickly returned to the workshop and assembled a rough prototype from the salvaged tube, spare rifle stockwood, and basic firing components. The first test was critical. If the backblast proved dangerous or if the rocket detonated inside the tube, the entire effort would fail. Ewell carried the device to a remote area along the Potomac River to conduct an unofficial trial. He loaded a rocket, aimed across the water, and pulled the trigger. The projectile launched smoothly, with minimal recoil and no harmful blast toward the operator. The rocket traveled hundreds of feet before splashing into the river. The propellant burned almost entirely within the tube, allowing the remaining exhaust to exit safely behind the shooter. Encouraged by the result, Ewell presented the prototype to Skinner. Together they refined the launcher, improving the sights, strengthening the firing mechanism, and ensuring the electrical ignition system would work under field conditions. They also produced inert rockets for safety testing. Performance exceeded expectations in every trial. The final step was convincing senior Army leadership. The demonstration at Aberdeen would determine whether this improvised tube launcher would be dismissed as a curiosity or adopted as a practical solution to one of the Army's most urgent battlefield problems. In May 1942, a weapons demonstration was quickly organized at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The U.S. Army was evaluating several experimental anti-tank systems, including large spigot mortars operated by sizable crews and designed to fire shaped charge munitions. Engineer Skinner recognized an opportunity. He and his colleague would present their own rocket launcher alongside the more established designs. The comparison would either confirm their work or reveal its shortcomings. When senior officers arrived that morning, Skinner noticed a major oversight. The launcher had no proper sights. Only hours earlier, the team had improvised aiming guides from a bent wire coat hanger shaped with a broken nail. There were no calibrated optics or precision instruments, just a rough visual reference for aiming. Testing began with the spigot mortars. 5 different models fired repeatedly at a moving tank. Although effective against stationary targets, none managed to score a hit on the vehicle in motion. The observing generals were disappointed but not shocked. Hitting a moving tank with anti-armor weapons under field conditions was notoriously difficult. Then Skinner's team stepped forward. He braced the launcher on his shoulder, tracked the tank, and fired. The rocket shot out with a distinctive sound and struck the tank moments later. Some observers assumed it was luck. He fired again and hit again. Repeated shots found their mark. With crude, improvised sights and a launcher assembled from simple materials, Skinner and his partner consistently hit the moving target while the more sophisticated mortars had failed entirely. General Barnes, a veteran of countless weapons trials, stepped closer. Clearly intrigued, he asked more as an order than a request to try the launcher himself. After a brief explanation of the straightforward firing process, Barnes shouldered the tube, aimed, and fired. Direct hit. Smiling, he remarked that the device resembled Bob Burns's bazooka, referencing a popular comedian whose homemade musical instrument bore the same name. The nickname immediately stuck, first informally and then officially, soon becoming synonymous with infantry anti-tank rockets for decades. Barnes filed a favorable report that same day, leading to immediate orders for 5,000 launchers, not for testing, but for combat use. Shortly afterward, another demonstration was held at Camp Sims in Washington, D.C., attended by General George C. Marshall and senior U.S. and Allied officials. Marshall promptly ordered 5,000 launchers, 25,000 anti-tank rockets, and 5,000 training rounds. General Electric received the production contract on May 20, 1942, with an extremely tight 30-day deadline. Engineers at the company's Bridgeport, Connecticut facilities rapidly reverse-engineered the prototype. The design's simplicity: steel tube, wooden stock, basic trigger, battery ignition made mass production feasible. Officially designated the 2.36-inch rocket launcher MUN, the weapon was universally known as the bazooka. General Electric completed the first 5,000 units with just 89 minutes to spare. Formal adoption followed on June 14, 1942. Initial rocket production, including 25,000 Mi-6 anti-tank rounds and 5,000 practice rockets, was handled by the E.G. Budd Company. However, the rocket ammunition presented serious challenges. Early Mi-6 rounds were plagued by reliability issues, faulty primers, damaged fins during transport, and inconsistent propellant burn rates. In hot weather, rockets could burn too quickly and risk rupturing the tube. In cold conditions, they burned too slowly, sometimes scorching the operator. Electrical ignition systems struggled in wet or freezing environments, and structural weaknesses in the contact ring caused further failures. When functioning properly, the shaped charge warhead was highly effective, but many rockets failed to perform. These problems became evident during the weapon's combat debut. On November 8, 1942, Allied forces launched Operation Torch, landing in French North Africa under intense Mediterranean sunlight. More than 10,000 American and British troops came ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers in the first major U.S. offensive of the war. Some units carried the new Moen bazookas. On the eve of the landings, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower discovered that many troops had received no training with the new weapon. The launchers had been shipped so quickly that soldiers often first encountered them aboard transport ships. There were no manuals, instructors, or practice ammunition, just crates containing unfamiliar tubes and rockets with assurances that they could stop tanks. Early fighting in North Africa proved chaotic. Vichy French forces resisted more strongly than expected, and German reinforcements soon arrived in Tunisia. American troops, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, struggled with unfamiliar equipment and leadership challenges. As a result, the bazooka, so impressive during trials, saw little effective use during the initial Torch landings. A weapon that had excelled in controlled demonstrations failed to make an immediate impact once real combat began. The first recorded battlefield use of the weapon came during the campaign in Tunisia. On February 12, 1943, in the midst of the fighting around Kasserine Pass, the 168th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division received its initial shipment of bazookas. Just 2 days later, on February 14, troops were forced to employ them against German armored assaults despite having almost no preparation and facing extremely unfavorable conditions. Results in Tunisia were disappointing. The early Mi-6 rockets were unreliable and frequently failed to fire. Many soldiers had never trained with the launcher and struggled to estimate range or properly lead moving tanks. The weapon's electrical ignition system proved fragile in harsh field conditions. Moisture seeped into the circuitry, battery contacts corroded in the salty coastal air, and propellant inside the rockets absorbed humidity, causing weak burns or total failures. After several months of combat, U.S. Army ordnance officials assembled a troubling report. When an American general visited the Tunisian front after operations ended in 1943, he could not find a single confirmed case in which the weapon had destroyed an enemy tank. Reports from the field described rockets striking armor only to ricochet harmlessly, fail to detonate, or miss their targets. By May 1943, the Army halted further distribution of the Moen bazooka. The project appeared close to cancellation after significant financial investment in a system that had not fulfilled its primary purpose. Nevertheless, key figures including Skinner, Uhl, and engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground persisted. They began systematically correcting each identified flaw. A redesigned rocket, the Mi-6 Aeon, introduced a new contact system that unspooled wire from the rear instead of relying on a fragile nose ring. Propellant charges were shortened to reduce internal pressure, and both fuse and ignition components were upgraded. The launcher itself evolved into the Moen Aeon, a simplified version that removed the forward hand grip, added a protective face guard, incorporated a conical muzzle deflector and carrying strap, improved the safety system, and reduced weight from roughly 18 pounds to about 123.4 pounds. The sighting mechanism was also simplified, with calibrated markings for distances between 100 and 300 yards. Equally important was the introduction of proper training. Soldiers were finally given opportunities to fire practice rounds on dedicated ranges, and tactics were developed for two-person crews consisting of a gunner and a loader. By the summer of 1943, both the improved equipment and better prepared troops were ready for another test, this time during the invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky began on July 10, 1943, when more than 180,000 Allied troops landed on Sicilian shores, supported by large naval and air forces. Among them were paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division carrying updated bazookas into combat. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regimental Combat Team, had ensured that his men trained thoroughly with the new weapon. Unlike the hurried introduction in North Africa, these troops understood its strengths and limitations and had practiced engaging moving targets. Gavin later wrote that the bazooka was critical because it provided the only realistic means for his paratroopers to confront German armored vehicles. Yet the airborne drop itself went badly. Strong winds scattered units across roughly 50 miles of countryside. Gavin landed far from his intended zone and gathered a small group while moving toward nearby fighting. By dawn on July 11, scattered American paratroopers were holding positions along a ridge later known as Piazza Ridge, facing elements of the German Panzer Division. German forces advancing toward them included Tiger tanks from the 215th Tank Battalion, Panzer IV medium tanks, hundreds of infantry, and armored artillery support. The Americans were outnumbered and lacked heavy weapons, but they did have bazookas. Early shots fired at the front of Tiger tanks had little effect. Rockets struck the heavy frontal armor and bounced away without penetrating, confirming a known limitation of the shaped charge warhead against such thick plating. In the confusion, some soldiers fired in desperation. Gavin later recalled that rounds simply glanced off the massive 60-ton vehicles, which responded with 88mm cannon fire. Several bazooka teams were overrun as tanks advanced during the vulnerable loading and firing process. More experienced non-commissioned officers kept their composure. Training emphasized aiming at vulnerable areas, side armor, rear engine compartments, and tracks. As German tanks maneuvered to line up their main guns, American teams shifted position to seek better angles. The fight at Piazza Ridge lasted through a long and intense day. Naval gunfire from U.S. destroyers, along with the eventual arrival of Sherman tanks, proved decisive in stabilizing the situation. Around 7 p.m., Lieutenant Harold H. Swingler of the 505th PI arrived with Sherman tanks and roughly 50 men from regimental headquarters. During the action, he captured a Tiger tank intact after killing its crew with a grenade while they were outside the vehicle. Swingler himself would later be killed in action on June 6, 1944, during the D-Day landings. By late afternoon, the German offensive had lost momentum. Elements of the Hermann Göring Division pulled back after sustaining casualties, abandoning some equipment in the process. At least one Tiger tank was reportedly taken intact. During the wider Sicilian campaign, which lasted until 17 August 1943, Muneoni bazookas were credited with destroying several German armored vehicles, including 4 medium tanks and 1 Tiger I. Military accounts later described the Tiger's destruction as the result of a highly unlikely strike said to have passed through the driver's viewing slit, though no detailed record survives identifying the exact unit, location, or personnel involved. In his after-action assessment, General James Gavin noted that the bazooka was highly effective when handled by properly trained soldiers and used against suitable targets. Once employed correctly, the weapon proved its worth. Reports from Sicily quickly spread through American ranks. Troops who had doubted the launcher after its mixed performance in North Africa began asking for it. Instruction programs were standardized across divisions, and tactical doctrine was refined. The bazooka moved from experimental status to regular infantry equipment. Its impact, however, was felt just as strongly by German forces. German intelligence had first learned of the weapon while questioning captured U.S. troops in Tunisia in early 1943. Additional examples had already fallen into German hands in late 1942 on the Eastern Front, where Soviet units supplied through Lend-Lease used them, and more were captured during the fighting in Tunisia in February 1943. German ordnance specialists examined the launcher carefully. They were already familiar with shaped charge principles, but the simple delivery system impressed them. Development of a German equivalent began immediately. By 1943, German units were fielding the Raketen Panzerbuch the 43, followed by the improved RP's B-54 entering service in early 1944. Nicknamed the Panzerschreck, tank terror, and sometimes called the stovepipe because of its heavy smoke output, it was essentially a larger bazooka. The warhead diameter increased from 60 mm to 88 mm, allowing penetration of roughly 160 to 230 mm of armor under favorable conditions, about twice the capability of the American launcher, which typically penetrated 76 to 102 mm. The resemblance to the American design was obvious to US soldiers, but the German weapon had notable disadvantages. American rockets burned their propellant inside the launch tube, while Panzerschreck rockets continued to burn for about 2 meters after leaving the muzzle. This produced a severe backblast that could injure the operator. German crews had to wear heavy gloves, protective capes, and gas masks without filters. Later models added a blast shield, but that raised the weapon's weight to about 24 pounds compared with the Monaion's roughly 13 pounds. In the field, this extra weight reduced mobility. American bazooka teams could fire and quickly relocate, while German teams were slowed by both gear and weapon. The enormous smoke cloud from firing also made their position easy to spot. Roughly 300,000 Panzerschreck launchers were manufactured during the war. Meanwhile, the American bazooka continued to evolve. The Menin version, introduced in October 1943, featured a 2-section tube that could be separated for transport, especially useful for airborne troops. Assembled, it measured about 61 inches, broken down just over 31 inches. Unloaded weight was approximately 15.9 pounds. Wooden components were replaced with metal, and the unreliable battery ignition system was replaced by a Magnavox 6 magneto trigger, eliminating frequent failures. In September 1944, the General Electric T-43 aperture sight was replaced by the Polaroid T-90 optical reflector sight. Rate of fire reached about 10 rounds per minute. Production reached 26,087 units. An improved Monaio followed in June 1944 with stronger coupling mechanisms. It became the most widely produced model, with 277,819 units built by the end of the war. Equally important was the Mystics A3 rocket, introduced in late 1943. Its blunt hemispherical nose reduced ricochet from sloped armor, while redesigned fins improved stability. Adjustments to the shaped charge standoff and propellant made it more reliable in varying temperatures. At effective ranges of roughly 250 to 300 yards, the rocket could consistently penetrate 89 to 102 mm of armor. Soldiers who had once complained about the bazooka's unreliability now valued it highly. It became especially useful in Italy, where mountainous terrain favored defensive positions and limited tank maneuvering. German forces fortified hillside villages and used narrow valleys as defensive kill zones. American infantry advancing through these areas encountered machine gun nests, mortars, and dug-in armored vehicles. The bazooka fit the environment well. It could strike fortifications from distances far beyond grenade range, up to about 300 yards. High-explosive anti-tank rounds proved effective against machine gun emplacements and light vehicles. Its versatility exceeded its original purpose. At Monte Cassino in early 1944, where Allied troops spent months trying to break through German defenses, bazookas were often used against fortified positions rather than tanks. A warhead capable of piercing several inches of steel could also breach reinforced concrete. The weapon's most demanding test came on 6 June 1944 D-Day. American troops landing on Omaha Beach brought bazookas ashore in the first waves. Under intense fire, with heavy casualties in the surf and on the sand, bazooka teams moved toward German strongpoints. The launchers played a key role in neutralizing fortified positions that had pinned down entire units. Engineers used them to clear obstacles, while infantry fired them at bunkers to suppress machine gun fire long enough for flamethrower teams to approach. In the weeks after the landings, as Allied forces fought through Normandy's dense hedgerows, the bazooka became essential for countering German armor concealed in ambush positions. The thick vegetation created close-range battle conditions, often measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. In such terrain, the portable anti-armor power of the bazooka frequently made the difference between survival and destruction for advancing infantry. German tank protection did not stand still during the war. The Panthers' sharply angled front plating could often bounce even upgraded American Misty-3 rockets unless they were fired from extremely close range, while the heavy Tiger tanks remained largely resistant to frontal hits. U.S. infantry adapted by coordinating their efforts. Riflemen would pin down enemy troops as bazooka teams attempted to flank armored vehicles and strike from the sides. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, described the bazooka as an emergency weapon meant to stop tanks only when they threatened to overrun infantry, ideally at distances of roughly 30 yards less than 100 feet. At such proximity, however, tank-mounted machine guns could cut down an anti-tank team almost instantly. Casualties among bazooka operators were high, and those assigned to the role understood they were expected to move toward armored vehicles capable of destroying them from far beyond bazooka range. Even so, volunteers for anti-tank duty were never in short supply. Among the most unusual stories of bazooka use is that of Lieutenant Colonel Charles M. Carpenter. Born on August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois, he grew up near the small community of Reynolds. His family lost their farm during the Great Depression. After attending Roosevelt Military Academy and later Center College in Kentucky on scholarships, he became a history teacher at Moline High School before entering military service. Carpenter enlisted in 1942 as a second lieutenant, trained as a pilot with artillery liaison units, and arrived in France in 1944. Assigned to the 4th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army, he served as an artillery spotter and reconnaissance aviator. He flew an L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft, serial number 3030426, which he named Rosie the Rocketer, a nod to the wartime symbol Rosie the Riveter. Carpenter attached 6 Monet-owned bazooka launchers to the plane, later replacing them with Menine models. 3 tubes were mounted on each side using plywood panels secured to the wing. Struts. Fully loaded, the installation weighed about 106 pounds. The launchers were connected to an electrical firing system in the cockpit with push-button controls that allowed either individual shots or full salvos. To keep the aircraft light and agile, Carpenter usually flew alone. His attack method involved descending from higher altitude to roughly 100 meters above the target, releasing rockets, and then climbing sharply to avoid return fire. By firing from above, he aimed at the relatively thin top armor of German tanks. Often 40 to 45 millimeters on Tiger turret roofs, compared with over 100 millimeters at the front. Official records credit Carpenter with destroying 6 tanks, including 2 Tiger I heavies, though some witnesses claimed as many as 14. His first notable success occurred on September 20, 1944 during fighting near Aracourt, when he destroyed an armored car and 4 tanks in one day across 3 missions, firing 16 rockets in total. In October of that year, he added 4 more tanks and an armored truck to his tally. For his actions, Carpenter received the Silver Star from General Patton for gallantry in ground combat, along with the Bronze Star Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars, the American Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. His exploits were covered in Stars and Stripes, the Associated Press, Popular Science in February 1945, the New York Sun, and Liberty magazine. In one interview, he remarked that German forces had begun targeting his small observation plane whenever it appeared, joking that cubs with bazookas were now taken seriously. In 1946, Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and given a prognosis of 2 years. He returned to teaching at Urbana High School in Illinois and lived until March 22, 1966, nearly 2 decades longer than doctors expected. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, was restored and placed on display at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, beginning in 2020. That same year, his daughter Carol Carpenter Aker helped publish a biography titled Bazooka Charlie, The Unbelievable Story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. Many other wartime incidents demonstrated the risks and effectiveness of bazooka teams. Private First Class Francis Sherman Red Curry of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, earned the Medal of Honor for actions on December 21, 1944, in Belgium. When German tanks pushed through American lines, Curry and 5 soldiers retreated into an abandoned factory. Finding a bazooka but no ammunition, he sprinted across a street under heavy fire to retrieve rockets from a deserted half-track. According to his citation, he and another soldier then knocked out a tank with a single shot despite intense enemy fire. Curry later said the rocket struck precisely where the turret met the hull, an outcome he described as almost miraculous. He lived until October 8, 2019 and gave numerous interviews in later life. First Lieutenant Waverly Wright Deacon Ray of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, led a bazooka team in Normandy near a railway bridge in June 1944. When early shots fell short, he advanced personally to close the distance. Machine gun fire struck him and he died from his wounds. Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort later considered Ray an overlooked counterpart to World War I hero Sergeant Alvin C. York. Another example involved 19-year-old Albert Dargo, a member of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun crew. On December 19, 1944, near Stoumont, Belgium, he volunteered to help engage German tanks despite never having fired a bazooka before. In a 2014 interview, he recalled expecting he might not survive the attempt. After hitting one of 4 enemy tanks supported by infantry, he reloaded and returned to fire again to ensure it was disabled. Engineer Wilbur Bill Brunner used his Minine bazooka in 1945 near Dortmund, Germany, to destroy a German half-track blocking an autobahn underpass. He later remembered the vehicle exploding violently, likely due to ammunition inside, and was relieved his team had kept a safe distance. On January 4, 1945, during Operation Nordwind near Rimling in Alsace, a Jagdtiger at 79 tons, the heaviest armored fighting vehicle of the war, was hit in its vulnerable side armor by either a bazooka or an American Mi-36 tank destroyer. The resulting ammunition explosion killed the crew and marked the first combat loss of that type. Although its frontal armor measured roughly 250 millimeters and was extremely difficult to penetrate, the sides were only about 80 millimeters thick. During the Battle of the Bulge in mid-December 1944, particularly around the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath and nearby crossroads in the Ardennes, bazooka teams were credited with destroying more than 20 German armored vehicles. These episodes illustrate both the danger and importance of portable anti-tank weapons. Despite limited range and high risk, bazookas remained a critical tool for infantry confronting heavily armored German vehicles throughout the European campaign, although it wasn't the sole reason American forces managed to hold certain strategic positions. The weapon proved how useful it could be in extreme close-quarters situations. In the Pacific War Zone, however, the bazooka operated under very different conditions. Japanese armored vehicles were generally lighter and less protected than their German counterparts, which made them easier to disable. Yet Japanese doctrine relied far more on static defenses, caves, bunkers, and reinforced strongpoints than on maneuvering tanks. As a result, US Marines and Army units most often fired bazookas at fortifications rather than armored columns. The launcher turned out to be highly effective for breaking open pillboxes without forcing troops to approach at dangerously short distances. Rockets filled with white phosphorus were especially useful in cave warfare, since the burning chemical produced thick, suffocating smoke that drove defenders into the open. During battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bazooka operators frequently coordinated with flamethrower teams, blasting openings into hardened positions that were then cleared with fire. Tropical conditions created their own set of problems. Heat and moisture interfered with the electrical firing systems of early MUN and MUN-AON versions, causing frequent misfires. Rubber components deteriorated quickly, and metal parts corroded despite protective finishes. The later Mi-9 model used a magneto-ignition system that was more dependable than battery-powered firing mechanisms, but reliability issues never fully disappeared. By August 1945, when the war ended, the United States had gained extensive experience with shoulder-launched rockets. Between mid-1942 and spring 1945, American factories produced 476,628 bazookas of various types. Output included 112,791 units built from June 1942 to August 1943, 59,932 munitions made between July and October 1943, 26,087 mini launchers produced from October 1943 through June 1944, and 277,819 munitions. The final wartime model, the Mi-18, was produced in very small numbers, only 500 between April and August 1945, and just 350 reached combat units. General Electric accounted for roughly 91.6% of total production. Another contractor, Cheney Bigelow Wire Works in Springfield, Massachusetts, built about 40,000 Mi-18 launchers under a 1,944 contract worth $1,863 and earned the Army-Navy E Award 3 times for its wartime performance. Rocket production exceeded launcher output by a wide margin. By the end of the conflict, practice and smoke had been manufactured. The relatively simple design of the system allowed Allied troops to learn its operation quickly. Several Allied and partner nations received bazookas as well. Free French forces obtained 11,350 units, making them the largest foreign users. The Soviet Union received around 3,000 through Lend-Lease, though Soviet troops generally preferred anti-tank rifles. Brazil was supplied with roughly 2,900, the United Kingdom with 2,100, China with 2,000, Canada with about 170, and Slovak insurgents with 162 delivered by air during their 1944 uprising. As the conflict entered its final phase, it became increasingly clear that the 2.36-inch bazooka struggled against newer German tanks. The sloped armor of the Panther often resisted hits even from the sides unless struck at favorable angles. The Tiger II, introduced late in 1944, was nearly immune except from the rear. U.S. set. Ordnance engineers responded by examining captured German Panzers launchers and began work in October 1944 on a redesigned system known as the M20 Super Bazooka. This new launcher had a caliber of 88.9 mm, 3.5 inches, similar to the German weapon. Built from a 2-piece aluminum tube, it measured about 60 inches assembled and roughly 33 inches when broken down, with an unloaded weight of 14.3 pounds. It used a magneto-firing mechanism in the grip and included an optical sight. Its MIS-218A2 rocket could penetrate roughly 280 mm, 11 inches of armor, almost twice the capability of the earlier 2.36-inch model. Effective range was about 150 meters against moving targets and up to 300 meters against stationary ones, with a firing rate of about 6 rounds per minute. The M20 was officially designated late in 1944, but production remained limited and began in earnest only after the war. Because hostilities in Europe ended in May 1945, the weapon never reached front-line units there. In the Pacific, where Japanese armor posed less of a threat and the focus remained on fortified positions, the original bazooka remained sufficient until Japan's surrender in August 1945. That experience soon proved relevant again. On June 25, 1955 years after World War II ended, North Korean forces, supported by about 150 Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. US and South Korean troops were unprepared and lacked effective anti-tank weapons. South Korea possessed nearly 2,000 MN9A-owned 2.36-inch bazookas, but these proved largely ineffective against the T-34-85's 9,100 mm frontal armor. On July 5, 1950, Task Force Smith 46 American soldiers faced roughly 5,000 North Korean troops backed by more than 30 tanks. Armed with only 6 Men-9A-owned launchers, they fired 22 rockets without stopping a single tank. The projectiles simply failed to penetrate. The unit was forced to retreat. 3 days later, Colonel Robert Martin of the 24th Infantry Division was killed while attempting to halt a T-34 with the same weapon. Recognizing the urgency, General Douglas MacArthur requested immediate delivery of the M20 Super Bazooka on July 8, 1950, the 13th day of the war. Rock Island Arsenal quickly shipped the new launchers to Korea along with instructors from Fort Benning, and training manuals were drafted in just 2 weeks. The M21st saw combat on July 20, 1950, when elements of the 24th Infantry Division used it during fighting in Daejeon. The impact was immediate. 8 T-34 tanks were reportedly destroyed on the weapon's first day in action. Contemporary reports even claimed 7 tanks were knocked out in 7 shots. Major General William F. Dean personally fired an M20 at a T-34 from a second-story window at close range, hitting the turret ring and setting the tank ablaze. Of 10 tanks present in the city that day, 6 were eliminated by M20 fire and 2 by artillery. Dean later received the Medal of Honor, the first of the Korean War, for his actions, including his use of the launcher. He was captured after the battle and remained a prisoner of war until September 1953. More than 750 MAFD launchers were delivered to Korea during their first year of deployment. In 1952, an upgraded model, the M20 Aeon, entered service with a redesigned connector latch and quickly became the primary production variant. Another version, the MES-20 Bone, introduced a cast aluminum tube and simplified internal parts to reduce weight. The MES-20 Aeon Bone later merged those lighter components with earlier M2 Aeon improvements. During the Korean War, the so-called Super Bazooka demonstrated clear battlefield value, destroying large numbers of enemy tanks and fortified targets. Despite these successes, the M20 platform was already nearing the limits of its usefulness. Tank protection kept advancing, forcing shaped charge warheads to grow in diameter to maintain armor-piercing performance. At the same time, the reloadable launcher, requiring 2 soldiers and several rockets, was gradually replaced by lighter single-use systems. By the mid-1960s, as US forces entered Vietnam, the bazooka's era was fading. The Mi-72 law provided comparable anti-armor capability in a disposable launcher weighing roughly a third as much and operated by a single infantryman without reloading. The bazooka continued to appear in limited roles early in the Vietnam War, especially against bunkers and strongpoints, but it steadily disappeared from American inventories. Even so, the basic idea, first realized by Leslie Skinner and Edward Uhl in 1942, became a permanent feature of modern infantry warfare. Shoulder-fired rocket launchers used worldwide, from the AT-4 and RPG-7 to the MUN-136 and Panzerfaust III, trace their lineage to that original tube-launched concept. The shaped charge warhead remains the standard method for infantry to defeat armored vehicles at close range. Its psychological effect was just as important as its technical performance. Before 1942, tanks were almost untouchable by individual soldiers. The bazooka changed that equation. 2 infantrymen carrying roughly 50 pounds of gear could eliminate a 50-ton armored vehicle. From then on, tank crews could not operate safely without infantry support, and combined arms tactics became essential. Corporal Donald E. Lewis, who took part in penetration tests against a captured German Panther using both the German RP's B-54 Panzerschreck and the American mine bazooka, later remarked that he was so impressed by the German launcher that he would have gladly used it himself. He informed his superiors that the Panzerschreck outperformed the American weapon, a reminder that US forces understood the limitations of their own system even while employing it effectively. Leslie Skinner died on November 2, 1978, at age 78 in Clearwater, Florida. Obituaries across the United States credited him as co-inventor of one of the Second World War's most influential infantry weapons. After the war, he was sent to the Pacific in July 1945 to manage ordnance supply, then assigned to the California Institute of Technology to establish an ordnance office. He retired from the Army as a colonel in 1948, receiving the Legion of Merit, and joined Aerojet Engineering in California. Recalled during the Korean War, he served in the U.S. Air Force from 1950 to 1952, helping create a weapons testing facility at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Following his second retirement in 1952, he worked as a consultant for Oerlikon Weapons Manufacturing until 1970. Later he moved to Florida, turned to sculpture, and devoted his creativity to art. Skinner was buried at Arlington National Cemetery and received the Hickman Award from the American Rocket Society. Edward Ohl lived until May 9, 2010, passing away at 92 in Oxford, Maryland after a stroke. Leaving the Army in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, he joined the Glenn L. Martin Company and later Martin Marietta, working on guided missile programs, and eventually becoming Vice President of Engineering. From 1959 to 1961, he served as Vice President at Ryan Aeronautical, then joined Fairchild Engine and Airplane Company, later Fairchild Industries, as President. He became chairman in 1976 and oversaw the firm's evolution from a military aircraft builder into a major aerospace corporation. Programs under his leadership included the Matador, Bullpup, and Pershing missiles, the F-105 and A-10 aircraft, and several satellite systems. He stepped down as chairman in 1985. Ohl married Maureen Barbara Kelleher in 1943 and had 4 children, including 2 sons who attended Lehigh University. In later interviews, Ohl emphasized that the bazooka's development came from urgency and practical problem-solving. In 2007, he recalled that the US military initially lacked any effective anti-tank weapon and was poorly prepared for modern combat in 1941. By 1945, however, it had become the most powerful military force in the world, an evolution made possible in part by innovations like the bazooka. A telling encounter occurred in 1985 at a reunion in Germany of veterans from the European campaign. A former German Panther commander approached an American veteran who had carried a bazooka across France and Germany. Speaking through an interpreter, the German admitted that the tube-launched rockets frightened them more than Allied tanks. Sherman tanks, he explained, were easier to counter, but rockets could come from unseen infantry. Crews sometimes abandoned undamaged vehicles simply after hearing the distinctive launch. When asked why, the German answered quietly, they feared the next shot might strike a weak point or arrive from behind. The constant threat mattered as much as the weapon itself. The bazooka's most significant effect may not have been purely tactical, but psychological. German armored crews that had once advanced across Europe with confidence now had reason to feel exposed. A weapon carried by ordinary infantry created a persistent sense of vulnerability inside even heavily protected vehicles. That shift in perception alone altered the dynamic between tank and foot soldier. Its influence extended well beyond wartime combat. The shaped charge concept behind the bazooka's warhead later became essential in fields such as demolition, mining, and industrial metal cutting. Likewise, the rocket propulsion techniques refined during its development fed directly into post-war missile research. Many of the engineers who built and tested bazooka rockets carried their experience into guided missile programs during the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds, helping shape early Cold War technology. Resistance groups in occupied Europe also benefited. French partisans who received the launchers through Allied supply drops discovered that the weapon was well suited for ambushes against German supply columns. It required relatively little instruction, making it practical for irregular fighters who lacked the time or structure for formal training. By the 21st century, shoulder-launched rocket systems have become far more advanced than their original designers could have anticipated. Modern launchers feature tandem warheads capable of defeating reactive armor, improved targeting systems, and integrated electronics that extend range and accuracy. Weapons such as the Mi-3 Carl Gustaf, the FGM-148 Javelin, and the NLAW represent successive generations of improvement. Even so, soldiers often still refer to them generically as bazookas, a sign that the name has come to represent an entire class of weapons. Historians frequently note the unusual way the original system came into service. There was no prolonged committee oversight, no lengthy development cycle, and few large-scale trials before it reached the battlefield. It was simply a device that functioned well enough, could be built quickly, and could be distributed in large numbers. In contrast, contemporary weapons programs, often take decades and require enormous budgets. The original launcher cost only a few dollars per unit and could be maintained by infantry in the field. Production itself reflected wartime mobilization. Factories run by companies such as General Electric relied heavily on female workers, part of the broader industrial workforce symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Many of these workers knew their output would be sent directly to troops overseas. And personal connections to soldiers gave quality control a strong moral dimension. Even under tight deadlines, defect rates remained low. For infantry facing armored vehicles, the bazooka represented a dramatic change. Instead of relying on hazardous close-range tactics, soldiers could engage tanks from a safer distance with a realistic chance of success. This transition from near helplessness to practical capability was arguably the weapon's greatest contribution. It demonstrated that effective innovation did not always demand massive budgets or years of study. Sometimes it emerged from improvisation, urgency, and a willingness to test unconventional ideas. The engineers involved were not attempting to reshape warfare on a grand scale. They were addressing an immediate battlefield problem with limited time and resources. Yet their solution became one of the most influential infantry weapons of the conflict, proving that simplicity and practicality can outweigh complexity. The bazooka stands as an example of wartime ingenuity under pressure. It was neither refined nor flawless, but it was affordable, quick to produce, and effective enough to make a difference. Soldiers who carried it rarely reflected on its historical importance. Their concerns were survival, protecting comrades, and completing missions. The launcher was a tool, one that allowed them to challenge armored threats rather than endure them. That sense of empowerment, repeated across countless engagements throughout World War II, formed the weapon's enduring legacy. Its importance lies less in technical specifications or production totals and more in the confidence it gave to individual soldiers. When a young engineer noticed a discarded metal tube in 1942 and recognized its potential, a chain of events began: a prototype test, an improvised demonstration, rapid manufacturing, global deployment, and millions of rockets fired. The result was thousands of destroyed enemy vehicles and many lives saved. The story illustrates a broader lesson. Sometimes the most direct and practical solution, developed under pressure and executed quickly, can have lasting impact far beyond its original purpose.